My name is Aaliyah Deech, and I just want to welcome everyone to the ISDS Fest. This is the Interactions of Society and Environment seminar series. So I'm really excited. We have two different speakers today who will be talking about energy development and mapping social values in relation to this in Wyoming. And then we also have a second speaker who will be talking about water resources in the Colorado River Basin. So I'll introduce both of the speakers right before they talk. There will be time for questions in between each of the talks. So that way we have individual questions for Amy and individual questions for Faith. And then at the end, if we want to open it up to a broader discussion, that would be great. It'd be interesting to see what kind of resources or data sets that other people are using, as well as just kind of how we might look at integrating social data into natural resource management decisions. So first off, we'll start with Amy Posewicz. Amy has worked as a scientist or landscape ecologist with the Nature Conservancy, the Wyoming chapter, and Lander for the past 6 years. She does applied research related to conservation issues in Wyoming and providing support for conservation planning. Recent research projects for Amy have included evaluating the effectiveness of conservation strategies, such as conservation easements, sage grouse core area policies. It also projects future development patterns, identifies concentration areas for migratory birds, and mapping of social values, which we'll be talking about today. Before this, Amy lived in Moscow, Idaho for 7 years, where she completed an MS in remote sensing and GIS and a PhD in landscape ecology at the University of Idaho. She also has a BS in forestry from the University of Illinois and was a Peace Corps volunteer in Bolivia for 2 years. So she has great experience that we're really excited to hear about today. And I will turn it over to Amy.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I'm happy to be here today. I'm going to be talking about a project where we map people's preferences for oil and gas and wind development in Wyoming, and I'll specifically talk about that and how those map preferences relate to other things that people were asked to map, other kinds of values, and how they relate to distances from where people live and actual locations of energy development. I'd like to acknowledge my co-author on this presentation, Max Nielsen Pincus. He's with the University of Oregon, and Max and I know each other from our days as PhD students when we were in an interdisciplinary IGRIT program together, and Max had done this type of work and kind of coached me through this project. This was new to me when I took this on. So it's probably not a big surprise to folks in this audience that we have a lot of energy development happening in the western U.S. The map on the left, the brown areas, are places where there are lands leased for oil and gas development. Doesn't mean that all those places are developed, but many of them are proposed for development. And on the right, the green areas are areas with high potential for wind. They have good wind resources. And the orange areas are places with high potential for solar. So if you look at the two, you'll also notice there's not a lot of overlap spatially between those different kinds of energy development. So this is just something widespread and particularly notable in Wyoming. You'll see a lot of color on the map. So all of this energy development, of course, has brought challenges in trying to balance it with protecting other things that are important to people, including different biological resources and things important for social reasons. And so that's what we'll be talking about. Of course, energy development brings with it economic growth and jobs, but there can also be impacts to communities, things like agriculture, recreation, wildlife, and water quality. So the idea of doing social mapping was that we could potentially gather information from the public on what their preferences are for energy development and where they see places that are important for other values, and perhaps use that to inform planning for things like energy development. And perhaps early input up front could help to alleviate some of the conflicts that can arise related to new development. So I'll be talking about something that's often referred to as public participation GIS. I might call it PPGIS, or I might just say social mapping, and I'm talking about the same thing. This is something that captures community preferences and values spatially. So typically people are asked to place on maps markers or stickers in places that represent something to them. And it can encourage public participation in different processes. You could potentially use these data in land use planning or management or to inform policies. And it's nothing new. It has been done for a lot of different applications. People have looked into using this to inform national forest planning, identifying places important for a variety of different reasons. It's been looked at with relation to residential development and tourism development siting, but no one has looked at it until now for energy development in particular. And I just put a website address up on the screen. That's a great resource to learn more if you're interested in this kind of mapping. There's some great examples. So there's two things I'm going to talk about today, and the first is how different kinds of values align on the landscape, how they overlap or don't overlap, and what that might tell us about what people perceive as being compatible uses and what they perceive as being potentially conflicting uses, or where there might be conflict about land uses. There haven't actually been very many studies that have looked at this kind of overlap analysis. My colleague, Max Nielsen-Pincus, did do a study in Idaho and Oregon and found that people, when they map values, the biological and economic, tended to be in very distinct, different places. So people saw those as being different. Do we need to adjust something? Oh, okay. Not talking loud enough? Sorry. So potentially you could see how this can be useful for planning, but there haven't been very many studies looking at this. The second thing that I'm going to talk about is, does where people live matter? Okay, sorry I wasn't talking loud enough. I have two microphones. I don't understand. Maybe I can move that one. So first I'm going to talk about, we tested the theory of geographic discounting, which is basically the idea that people prefer to live closer to things they consider to be good, like parks, and farther away from things like prisons and landfills. And that's something that's been demonstrated, but not necessarily with this type of social mapping data. An extension of geographic discounting is the idea of NIMBY, or not in my backyard. Probably many of you have heard that terminology used before. People will often want things like wind development, renewable energy development, but they don't necessarily want it, right next to their house. So we wanted to test that with these data as well. Other studies that have been done looking at that NIMBY question with wind development in the U.S. that haven't used this type of mapping data have tended to survey people that either live close to turbines or far away from turbines. And so these are existing developments already on the ground. And they found that people close to turbines tend to have negative attitudes. People who live far away tend to be more positive about the idea of new wind energy development. And that's attributed to this NIMBY idea. What we do here is we have the fixed location of the participants who did this mapping, and then they place where would they like to see it in the future, which could potentially be a little more useful for understanding for future development people's attitudes about it. So to kind of sum up that intro, there's two research questions I'm going to talk about. The first is, what are the spatial relationships between social or cultural and biological values and development preferences, and is there evidence of geographic discounting or NIMBY in these data? And to help explain that, I'll also look at how it relates to where we actually see development already. So I'm going to start just giving an overview of where we did this study and the methods that we used. So this work was done in 3 counties in southern Wyoming, Sweetwater County, Carbon County, and Albany County. Albany County is the one that sits just north of here. This is a very rural area. The largest towns are Laramie and Rock Springs. Ranching is very important to the culture, and energy development has been very important to the economy, especially in Sweetwater and Carbon counties. There has been a lot of oil and gas development and mining. Wind energy development has been increasing pretty rapidly here, and most of the new projects have happened in the last few years in Albany and Carbon County. And later I'll show some maps that actually show where the energy development is. The other thing about these landscapes is they're still fairly intact. Even though there is some development, there's a lot of open spaces, a lot of large ranches, and pretty abundant wildlife populations. So there is a lot of potential for conflict with new development. We sent invitations to 2,000 people in the 3 surveys randomly, so these are just random residents who live there. They had the option to participate by internet or on paper. And the survey included a mapping exercise, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and a questionnaire. So for folks who got the paper maps, they had a sheet of stickers that they received, and these were little circular yellow stickers with attributes. And they could place these on the map in the place that represented that. So I'll just read a couple examples. For habitat protection, it said, it is important to protect fish and wildlife habitat in these places. So then they put their little H stickers where they thought was important for wildlife. For the new development, we asked them to say, if new wind energy development were to occur, where would you prefer to see it? And then they put their little wind development stickers in those places. The final type of attribute we asked about was what they knew about conditions. So at the very bottom, we had a series of things about, are the land conditions here good? Is the land in poor condition? Is there enough water? Is there not enough water? For the people who participated by internet, they saw a Google Maps interface, and they had little markers that they could drag and drop onto the screen, and they could zoom in and out. They had a little bit more flexibility, but they had exactly the same attributes to place. We had a fairly low response rate, but we did of 10%. But we did get a lot of data, about 6,000 points that were mapped from about 200 participants. About half the people ended up doing it online and half via paper. We had kind of our typical, what you'd expect, non-response. More men tended to participate, which is seen in a lot of surveys, and people with higher education level. Because we did the 2 survey modes, we did another study comparing what the effect of that might be, and there wasn't one really, except that we found people who did participate on paper spent a lot more time working on it than people who did it online. People who did it online just kind of, zoomed through it and put fewer points. But we found that there wasn't any sort of spatial bias associated with that. They put more points, but they really put them in the same places. So first I'll talk about the spatial relationship question. And we looked at this with cultural and biological values and the oil and gas and wind development preferences, looking at how those things overlapped or didn't. And for the cultural values, a lot of those attributes that I showed on the sticker sheet were grouped because they're all cultural things like recreation, agriculture, family, and then we had 2 different mapped attributes that were representative of biological conditions. So we started out with all those points, all those yellow stickers on the map, which are represented by the black dots here. And rather than analyze just the points, we did a density analysis to look at where are the places where there are the most points that represent kind of collectively where people thought was most important for that thing. So we did that using a kernel density approach. And there's a lot of methodology behind that, and I'll be happy to answer questions about it at the end. But I'm going to kind of skip over it now. So we created those polygons for each of those values and then measured how much they overlapped. About 3 different ways, which again I'll just kind of give you the high-level summary of that overlap. So this map shows the cultural values in green, the hot spots for them, and the biological values in the black hashed. And there was a lot of overlap in where people thought was important for cultural reasons and biological reasons. There was only 24% of the biological areas that fell outside of where people thought was important for more social, cultural reasons. And this is actually really useful to me as someone who works for a conservation organization in thinking about how we might use this data to inform our strategies for conservation work. So we're interested in protecting important places that are important biologically, which certainly would overlap with some of these areas. And if we were to focus our work in places also important to people for biological reasons, we might have more success, we might get more participation, and they might be engaging with groups that we might not normally work with, that were perhaps interested because they thought the area was important for recreation or they spent time with their family there. This map I've added on the development preference areas for wind in blue and the oil and gas in brown. And you'll see that there's not a lot of overlap. There's actually no overlap between places that people identified for oil and gas development and where they thought was important for biological or cultural reasons, and very little overlap with the wind development. So we're not seeing a lot of, we're seeing a lot of agreement or consistency, I guess, between the different types of values. There's not a lot of conflict among the participants about places that are important for development versus other things. So just to kind of sum that first part up, people did perceive biological and cultural values as being very compatible in the landscape, but not necessarily being compatible with development. If development were proposed in areas that they thought were important for biological and cultural values, there might be some conflicts over that. The conflict among the map points was low, though. We saw that there were distinct preferences for different types of things in different places, which I think provides, shows how this data could actually be useful to someone who would think about using it for a planning perspective, that it's fairly consistent. People collectively identified the same places for either one type of use or a different kind of use. Now I'm going to talk about the geographic discounting part of the study. Just want to illustrate what I mean again by geographic discounting. So we looked at where people lived in relation to the study area, and what we would expect is that they would place things that they think are positive close to home and what they think is negative far from home. And we did this using those attributes that represented either positive conditions or negative conditions. And what we found was exactly what I showed in the little cartoon version, is that they matched the positive things much closer to home than the negative things. So, and this difference was statistically significant. So we did find that geographic discounting existed in the social mapping data. I'm going to add the other values for reference. The letters are indicative of significance. If it shares the same letter, they were the same. You'll see that the cultural and biological and positive things were all mapped close to people's homes, and the development and negative things were tended to be mapped further from their homes. So this does beg the question, well, is the development further from home, is that indicative of NIMBYism? Are they just saying they don't want it in their backyard? So we did some additional analyses to try to narrow that down. And first I want to show how they map, how their preferences related to where development actually occurs. So what this map shows in the black outlined areas are those hot spots again for wind development, so where they were mapped. And then the blue are existing wind turbines, which are mostly in the eastern part of the study area. And then the green is where development is projected. And those projections come from a couple different studies that are currently in review. Happy to answer questions about those at the end as well. So the take-home from this map is it's fairly consistent where people map their preferences with where energy development is or is expected in development, even though they weren't provided this information when they completed the survey. Then to test for an NIMBY effect, we looked at how people map their preferences in relation to their house and current development. So if there were no NIMBY effect, they would have put their little wind development stickers kind of randomly with respect to their house, probably closer to their house than existing development, or close to existing development perhaps. If there were evidence that they didn't want it in their backyard, then we would expect they would map it further away than where it could potentially go. So if there were potential wind resources close to their home, but they put it, 300 kilometers away, that's suggesting that perhaps they just don't want it in their backyard. What we found is that people tended to map their wind preferences about the same distance from their house as were existing turbines. So what this graph is showing is the distance between, on average, participants' homes and either their map preferences, where current wind turbines are, or where projected wind turbines are. So the first two didn't differ, but the projected turbines is where we do start to see some evidence of a NIMBY effect. because there is the potential for wind development close to home, yet it was still being mapped farther away. We did an additional test of this to see if this is, in fact, NIMBY by looking at people's attitudes. So some of those survey questions were related to wind development, and we asked people to rate how they felt, positive, negative scale, about how wind development might affect agriculture, recreation, and wildlife. And we grouped these into positive or negative attitude scores for each person, and then for the positive and negative groups looked at did they map at different distances from their homes. What we found is that people with positive attitudes about wind development tended to place it closer to home, and people with negative attitudes tended to place it further away, which is consistent with the idea that this is about attitude that would relate to NIMBY rather than something else. So oil and gas development had a similar pattern where here we really saw that everything is clustered in one big blob in the middle of that map. So where people map their preferences, where we see oil and gas development now and we expect it in the future, was very clustered. And what we found for our NIMBY test is that people mapped oil and gas development very far from their house, the very first bar, about 100 kilometers away, and existing well might have been, 20 kilometers away from their house. But it appears that, based on looking at this map again, that they were really mapping it close to that large field. That area outlined in red there, where they'd seen development before, which is the second bar down, that existing large field. So it's not certain that this is necessarily a NIMBY effect. It may be that people are just putting oil and gas development where they are familiar with it. And they are more familiar with oil and gas development in general in these counties, since wind development is a fairly new phenomenon. So to summarize, we found some evidence of NIMBYism for wind development in the social mapping data, and think that probably the pattern we see with oil and gas development may be better explained by where development is, and that people may be placing their preferences close to where they're familiar with it. One really interesting thing, digging in a little deeper into the data, was that we saw differences amongst the counties, and it may be that the NIMBY effect was driven by Albany County. So Albany County is different from the other two because it hasn't had a big history of energy development. Sweetwater and Carbon counties have had oil and gas development, southern mining, coal mining for a long time, and so they're used to that kind of development. A lot of people in those counties are employed by those industries. And Albany County just hasn't had that history. And people in Albany County would map their wind development preferences in the other two counties 70% of the time, and the people in the counties that are used to development mapped it in their own counties 70% of the time, even though most of the time the wind development may not occur there or be likely to occur there. So that kind of industrial legacy has been found in the past to influence attitudes about development, and that may explain the pattern that we saw with these data as well. Just have a couple of take-home points I'd like to end with. We found clear preferences for where people would like to see development versus other values, which I think illustrates how that they could be useful for planning. There's some consistency there. And these data could be used to identify where development could proceed more efficiently. If agency looking at planning for public lands has this kind of information, they might identify where the public would be more supportive, or an individual company might save a lot of money by looking up front where there may or may not be support from the community. And as I pointed out, there's also opportunities for conservation initiatives to use this kind of data to work in places that are also very important to people. And we did find evidence of geographic discounting in NIMBYism, which just points out there are some biases in the data that would need to be considered if using them just to understand. But those biases also made this very useful for understanding a little better maybe what people's attitudes are towards energy development and what might be affecting that. And so that is all I have, and I would be happy to answer questions. I think that we will have to unmute the people on the phone, and I may need help with that.
I was wondering if you found any evidence of preferences to have the attitude towards oil and gas based on their livelihood.
You know, unfortunately, we did not ask details about livelihood in the survey, and I was kicking myself recently about that. All I know is really basic, like, are they employed, are they retired? So I wish I knew that. It would. I agree. Okay, I'm going to repeat the question this time because I forgot to do that. So I was asked if the NIMBY effect might be related to construction of new wind farms rather than having them there already. And there's not, right now in that study area, there's not a lot of active construction. At the time that the survey was done, the wind farms that are there now were already there. And I'm not sure we have enough wind farms to be able to look at that. There's only a few wind farms that already occur in the study area. So I can't really answer that question with this data set. But that they had been built, so I'm not sure if construction and the disturbance associated with that had an effect. The places that they value, are they protected for? Okay, the question is, are the places that people value for certain reasons already protected for those reasons? I would say blanket probably no. They were placed across a very wide area. Some of those areas fall on Forest Service lands that are perhaps protected for recreation in a sense, but they were widely distributed across different types of private and public lands and covered a big part of the study area. So I think there are places that are they may be places that are fairly accessible to people though, but I have not looked at that specifically. Okay. The question was about the difference between rural and urban participants, if there was more of one or the other, and if we found different responses. And I didn't have a big enough sample size to test the differences between urban and rural respondents. There were more respondents who lived in the major towns of Laramie, Rollins, Rock Springs, Green River, just because that's where the people are. This is a very rural landscape. But we had a fairly good balance of all of the small towns were included, and it was stratified by census block. So there were participants from a wide range across the county. My guess is that, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but probably, I'd say 60% were probably from the bigger towns and the rest from smaller areas.
Did you find the distance that they wanted to reach by further away than existing homes? Because sometimes they put them up and then they take all of the versus I wish it was another 3 miles away or something like that.
See, I'm not sure if I quite understand the question. So did we find, so what we found in the, we looked at the distance from people's homes where they wanted wind turbines, and they generally mapped that further than where they occur currently. But that was very close. Actually, I don't think that difference was statistically significant. So it may be, they're familiar with wind turbines in certain places, so they may have said, oh, that's a good place to put more. That could be another explanation for that. Yeah, the question was, is there anything I do differently next time to get more responses? And yes, there is! I have the answer to this. So I mentioned that we did an internet and a paper survey, and you know, the internet, it sounds wonderful. You're not going to have to process all these things. You're not going to digitize all these stickers. You know, people are just going to go online. You're going to instantly have all your information. And so we tried to do it that way, but we had this paper option. So people could either request the paper survey, and then we just sent them out because we weren't getting a response. But we weren't able to send them to everybody because we hadn't prepared to do a paper survey. So we ended up with this really neat test of the modes. And what we learned from it was that we would do paper surveys. And that probably would have increased the response rate 5 to 10% based on the calculations I did with the paper we did get back. I think just even though people had internet access, we asked them about that. Just having something in front of you, I think it's just easy, get it done, and yeah. Yeah, no, the question is about why people might have placed more points on the maps with paper, and you suggested already a possible response that they had a finite number of stickers, and they might have assumed they should use all of them. That's one possible explanation. And the other is that, the folks online, we did not instruct them to place a certain number. We didn't say, please place at least 6. And there's also seems to be, it's hard to pinpoint what it is, but there's something about the internet culture that you just move quickly. And it could be something like that happened as well. You know, you do things online and you just zip through it.
All right, then we'll move on. So thank you, Amy, very much. We appreciate it. Faith is our next speaker, so I'll just come up and do a little introduction here. So for Faith Thirdleaf is a PhD candidate at Colorado State University in Earth Sciences with a specialty in watershed sciences and policy under Melinda Latourie, and she's also a research associate at the Colorado Water Institute. Faith received a BA in Cultural Anthropology and Languages in Latin America from the University of Maryland, College Park, and a Master's of Agriculture at CSU through the Peace Corps Masters International Program, where she is a volunteer in Palau, Micronesia. So we had 2 Peace Corps volunteers here. So Faith is at the Colorado Water Institute. For a dissertation, she is working on a collaborative project with the 7 land-grant universities in agriculture, water, and the Colorado River Basin. So I'm going to switch over to her presentation here.
All right. I tried something a little different with my presentation today, so we'll see how this goes. Anybody used Prezi before? Yeah? Maybe no. I don't know what it is. It's an online software. It's open access, and we'll see how it goes. So I'm really honored to be speaking here today. Thank you so much, Aaliyah, and to the group about this project. I hold it very near and dear to my heart. So basically what I'll be talking about is a USDA-funded project on ag water in the Colorado River Basin. I'll be talking about some interviews that we did with regards to that project, as well as some mapping that we're going to try to do that we've done a little bit already. Again, this is a project, an ongoing project, so I don't have any findings. I have some general kind of conclusions that we've come up with, but it's still a work in progress. So I just want to make sure that you all know that. So we are identifying and I'll also talk about identifying and classifying boundaries in the Colorado River Basin and how boundaries really have an impact on agricultural water governance, and about some of the challenges that we have faced, the challenges we have faced, and the challenges we will face in mapping the interviews, and we'll get further into that. And I just wanted to let you know this is part of work that I'm doing with the Colorado Water Institute, as well as work that I'm doing for my dissertation. So I'll be talking a little bit about both, not going into a whole lot of depth, at least with regards to my dissertation, but I'll give you a little taste about what I'm doing. I also want to reference to the Colorado Water newsletter that came out. It was November, December 2012. And so there are 3 articles in here that I'm speaking about. So if anybody's interested, this is online on the Colorado Water Institute website, and you can download it. It's free. And you can also get a copy if you stop by CSU in the engineering building at the Colorado Water Institute office. So feel free to let me know if you need one. I can get you one. Let's see here. So basically, this is basically the website for this project. The project is called Addressing Water for Agriculture in the Colorado River Basin. And we're generally trying to look at what exactly, I don't expect you guys to read this all, it's very small, but just to show you that this is the website. We do have a website up in case you're interested in following the project. And so basically what we're looking at is how ag producers and water managers feel about the changes that are going on in the basin. There are quite a few changes. There are a lot of water transfers. There are a lot of lands that are being fallowed. And so how do ag water producers, managers feel about some of these changes? What are they finding? What are some of the ideas, solutions that they have to these changes, whether they're good, whether they're bad? And then we're also looking to see how we're asking them, how do you think universities can partner with them? How do they think we can partner with them to deal with some of these solutions or changes that are happening in the basin? So this is a collaborative project. The project is really a collaboration between the 7 land-grant universities in the 7 basin states. And those states in the Colorado River Basin are Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada, Nevada, and then California. And so we got together basically our first meeting. We got together at the University of Arizona. So largely these land-grant universities have water institutes such as the Colorado Water Institute in CSU. We weren't able to partner with all of the water institutes for all of the land-grant universities, but we did find a representative for each of the land grants to participate in this project. And so we met at the University of Arizona at the Water Institute there. Sorry. And we talked about how we're going to tackle three main project activities. The activities include interviews, mapping, and the survey. I'll be talking about the mapping and survey, the mapping and the interviews. There's a colleague at the Water Institute who's going to be focused on the survey, who did the survey, and she's doing the analysis now. So we got together, and we basically figured out how are we going to tackle these kind of large tasks, and to answer these questions. And we did a little mapping exercise with Sharon Magdal, who's the director of the institute down at the University of Arizona. And she really identified the key issue areas, the key issues, and some potential interviewees. We actually cut a map out, and the whole kind of participatory mapping thing, but it was more internal. And we were able to identify these key agricultural areas in Arizona and identify people to interview based on the information that she provided us. So this worked so well that we decided to go out to the other states and really look at how we could get this type of information, issues, the geographic areas of importance, and also potential needs for interviewees. So it was largely a snowball effect that we used to identify the interviewees. And let's see. So the interview team included myself, Dr. Pete Taylor from the Sociology Department at CSU, and Mary Lou Smith, who's a collaboration specialist at the Water Institute at CSU. And what we did is we literally did telephone surveys, 61 farmers, ag producers, and water managers throughout the basin. And these are the locations for the people that we interviewed. The interviews are all confidential. So we were able to identify, at least if they were part of an irrigation district or a water conservancy district, we were able to identify the town in which their headquarters were. And that's what's mapped here. So as part of my research for my dissertation, that's part of the larger project. As part of my dissertation research, I'm going to take a subset of these interviews and really look at those interviewees that are related to Bureau projects. The Bureau projects in the Colorado River Basin are largely ag-related. It's all, those are the biggest buckets of water for agriculture in the basin. And so I wanted to look at those, kind of where the water's at, where the agriculture is happening, look at that and really see where some of the water sharing arrangements were occurring, if they were occurring. There are very specific rules within the Bureau about how water can be used and where it can be used. And so I'm looking specifically at those arrangements. And they're actually different. I found a few water sharing arrangements within Bureau projects, which indicates that actually the Bureau of Reclamation has a little bit more flexible than what we would anticipate them to be. And so there are possibilities. Obviously, flexibility is key in terms of how water is used in the basin. And I think there's some really interesting lessons coming from these Bureau projects. So that's going to be a part of my dissertation. And again, I have not done that analysis. But when I do the analysis, what I'll be doing is I'll be doing a geospatial analysis and a textual analysis, looking specifically for geologic features in the interviews and hydrologic boundaries that have to do with surface and groundwater interactions, policies, and also social and cultural boundaries. So you ask yourself, well, what's a social and cultural boundary? So based on some of the interviews that we've gone through, what I've been able to identify, and again, I haven't done a thorough analysis, but there are ways to identify social and cultural boundaries, and one of those ways is through sectors. So you have the interaction between the agricultural, for example, and the municipal sector or the environmental sector, and those kind of boundaries will inform social values and perceptions as well. And so I'll be basing information off of specific boundaries, geographic boundaries that they have identified in the interview, and extract them to better understand some of those values and perceptions. Meanwhile, I've been collecting a lot of data in the Colorado River Basin. I've been and compiled that data in the geospatial database. I've been collecting data on federal lands, on irrigated and agricultural lands, and on ag water governance. So taking a look a little bit more closely at the federal lands, you can see that the majority of the basin is owned by the federal government, and which is largely the Department of the Interior, organizations such as the Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Reclamation, the Department of Defense, the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and National Park Service. So you might be wondering, well, where are people actually farming? And how is it that agriculture in the basin has the majority of the water if they have such a small percentage of the land? And this is a question I'll be looking further into. What's even also interesting, apart from that, despite all of these the Bureau of Reclamation projects throughout the basin, Bureau of Reclamation actually owns less than 1% of the land. They control most of the water through agricultural projects. And then in addition, you can't exclude the tribal lands. The tribal lands in the basin occupy about 16% of the land. So that's not leaving a lot for agriculture. And this is a very coarse picture of what agriculture looks like, the distribution of agriculture in the basin. And I say coarse because, well, first of all, this data was collected by my advisor, Dr. Melinda Lightry, and she did this work actually with TNC. They were curious to see if they could calculate and demonstrate the agricultural lands in the basin, being that they occupy so much of use so much of the water. And it was actually much more difficult than anyone anticipated. And these are the very coarse results from that study I'm not sure if they're going to continue to look into this question. I think it would be really interesting. But you have all kinds of discrepancies with this data. Discrepancies like crop classification. There are different crops in the upper basin and the lower basin. There's discrepancies in how the data was collected, so the methods in which that data was collected, and seasonal crops. So you have crops that are based, strictly on season. You also have discrepancies in the actual land that's used for agriculture. So you've got a lot of land now that's being fallowed, and does this picture account for some of that fallow land? So there's also a difference in time when the data was collected, and from year to year. As you can see, this is from 2005 to 2011. That's a big period of time. And then finally, this speaks to more of the methods, but a lot of this data is based on data that was volunteered. The farmers, I think our USDA has a website where they can inform them, the organization about how much land that's under production at any given time. So some people volunteer that information and some people don't. And so this is very limited view, but a view nonetheless. And probably, I think, the only calculated assessment of irrigated and agricultural lands in the basin for the Colorado River Basin. And then finally, my favorite topic is the agricultural water governance question. So how is water being managed in the basin? And it's variable. This is a very complex landscape, and this is just showing agriculture. So this isn't taking into account all of the organizations and institutions that manage water for other uses, municipal uses, recreational uses, environmental uses. This is just agriculture, and this also is not a complete data set. It also has a lot of different discrepancies. But largely, these are the kind of larger pockets of water in the basin. In Utah, for example, in doing this little exercise, this little activity, I found that even in the upper basin, if you follow my arrow, it kind of cuts across. This light green here is, these are tribal lands. So this essentially is the Navajo Reservation, and it goes into New Mexico and into Utah here. So basically, the upper basin kind of cuts across through the Navajo Reservation. So part of the Navajo Reservation is in the upper basin. In the upper basin is Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, part of Utah, and part of New Mexico. And then the lower basin is largely Arizona, Nevada, and California, with parts of Utah and New Mexico. And we'll talk about how that was deciphered. But basically, this is the line kind of the upper and lower basin. And even state by state governance is different. So, for example, in Utah, they manage water by the county. When we presented this data to a group of farmers at the Colorado Water Users Association, and I showed them a map of counties in the basin, and they asked me, well, why are you showing me counties? We don't manage water by counties. And I said, well, actually, some of us do, and Utah does. So whereas for example, in Wyoming, there are state projects, and even though there's a large federal, Bureau of Reclamation project in Wyoming, the Flaming Gorge, it's not agricultural water. So if we think simply agricultural water, we can think about we have a more limited view. And so Colorado's are kind of all over the board. There's the Colorado River District, then there are water conservancy districts, there are irrigation districts, and some of those are associated with Bureau projects. And then throughout the basin, there are thousands of irrigation companies. That is not shown here. I don't know how long it would take to get that data, but so the governance picture, like I said, is again very limited. In the lower basin, what's interesting is you see all these districts, and some of these are farms down here. This is California, and here this is Imperial Irrigation District in Coachella Valley. So what you've got in the lower basin is a very different management style or management mechanism rather, and that's through the Bureau of Reclamation. So basically the Bureau of Reclamation manages the lower river, the lower basin, and anyone who takes Colorado River water has a contract with the Bureau of Reclamation. So again, this picture does not even show those differences between upper and lower basin. I find it, I'm just fascinated by it, by the, overlapping jurisdictions, and how does anyone get any of this, straight? It's amazing, to think about how much water goes into agriculture and the complexity of the landscape for managing that. I mean, that's just baffling. And to try to, get a good picture of that, it's a challenge. And so this is just the first step at that. These layers, the federal lands, irrigated lands, these governance boundaries, and other data that I have will go into really mapping those into views. So this is kind of baseline data. And actually, we're really excited about the possibility of including data from different projects around the Colorado River Basin into that geospatial database, all different types of data. We have someone we're actually working with right now who's in the audience, Lindsay, to add some of the data that she's collecting on first through third tributaries, on ecological flows. So there's really great potential here. There is not a database like this out there on the Colorado River Basin. There's tons of data, and it ranges from all over the agencies, but there's not one place where you can find all this data. And then, of course, the value-added data from others. So going from the governance picture, then, I've started looking at boundaries and the importance of boundaries in governance. And so that's really what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to identify the important boundaries that are driving decision-making about agricultural water in the basin. And this is just a very quick overview of what I'm, kind of the correlations that can be made based on looking at these policies and trying to understand ag water governance. And I have 3 quick examples to show you, very simple. They're simplistic examples, but hopefully they will help you kind of understand the direction in which this boundary analysis is going. So the 3 examples, one is just literally the Colorado River Basin, the boundary around the basin, which is complicated, as you can imagine. The second is the state of Arizona, the Arizona Groundwater Act of 1980. And the third example will be Colorado, looking at a regional scale, the Colorado Water Rights Determination and Administration Act of 1969. And you can see here that I've identified 4 different scales at which these policies take place over the landscape or manifest over the landscape, and the boundaries that I have identified them to be representing. So let's take a look. First, we'll just look at the Colorado River Basin. This is actually a more complicated boundary than it looks. I know you see in these maps, as I've gone through the presentation. What you see here is you see 2 policies interacting. You see the Colorado River Basin Compact, which is all of the area north of the international boundary, and that's based on a 7-basin state agreement that took a very long time to get through in order to share water. And then the second policy is represented by the Mexico Water Treaty of 1944, and actually the Mexico Water Treaty represents 3 basins. It's not just the Colorado River Basin, but also the Tijuana and the Rio Grande. The Tijuana is just west here at the coast of California and Mexico, and then of course the Rio Grande is east of the Colorado River Basin that borders actually flows. It is the line between Texas and Mexico, the Rio Grande. And so this is more complicated. The reason I say this is more complicated than it looks is because both of these policies are based on hydrologic boundaries, physical boundaries, largely hydrology, surface hydrology. the lower part in California here is included in that boundary. It actually used to be, hydrologically, it used to be part of the basin. And through floods, drought, and a lot of infrastructure, that has changed and is no longer hydrologically part of the basin. However, with trans-basin diversions, it's definitely part of the basin that's managed by the Bureau. In fact, as I mentioned, the Imperial Irrigation District has a contract with the Bureau of Reclamation. So these are two policies, one large boundary based on hydrology that has manifested, made kind of a jurisdiction. These jurisdictional decisions are made based off of the hydrology of the basin. And then we go to the Arizona example. Here we've got the state of Arizona, and this is actually the Colorado River is the boundary between Arizona and Nevada, and the boundary between Arizona and California. It goes all the way down, and it is for a very short time, about 22 miles, the boundary between U.S. and Mexico. The Arizona Groundwater Act instituted what two jurisdictions that are called, one is called active management areas, and one are called the irrigation non-expansion areas. And these are kind of new jurisdictions since 1980 in which the state of Arizona has decided to manage their water. And I call this I call this kind of following the economic interests of the basin, because what they're really trying to do is maintain a sustainable supply of water, and groundwater specifically. And the non-extension areas are basically a very restricted area in which irrigation can only take place if it was implemented between certain dates. And so there's no longer any agricultural growth in these areas. And the AMA, the AMA are in orange, the active management areas that were instituted by the Groundwater Management Act of '80, and then the purple are the INAs, or the irrigation non-extension areas. And then our final example is just in Colorado, looking at the Colorado Water Right Determination and Administration Act of 1969, which instituted jurisdictions based on hydrologic division of the state's 7 hydrologic divisions, each with their own water court, water clerk, and a division engineer. And so these boundaries are largely constituted off of legal boundaries. So you have these kind of multiple intersecting boundaries, each with their own jurisdiction, each with their own organization, managing entity, and so I think that identifying some of these boundaries and identifying the way agricultural water is managed might help us in the future identify new water sharing arrangements. So some of the challenges I've already mentioned to you are, collecting data from public versus private sources. Private sources, you have the problem of, permission. Can we use the data? And not only can we use it, but can we show it? Can we demonstrate it? For example, we hope to serve the geodatabase up online, and we might have a problem serving up private data online. The reason why this is so sensitive, this is a very sensitive issue especially for farmers and ag producers in the basin, because at all costs, they will protect their water rights until their very last minute. Or the highest dollar. And it's a market value, so the prices fluctuate for water rights. Leasing, buying, selling, exchanging. So any data remotely related to their water rights, they will protect. And so it has not been easy finding some of the data from the smaller irrigation companies across the basin. Again, you have a question of availability. The data may be there, but is it digitized, for example? So do we have to go back into historical records and digitize everything? Accessibility. There are two problems really with accessibility. And one is, how can we access that data? And the second is, how can we serve that data? So how can we make it accessible for others? So there are questions like that. Of course, there's compatibility issues. You guys all know this, I'm sure, with the different resolutions, different scales. They come in at different. So do you project the data, or do you leave it unprojected and let someone else project it? That's been a problem. And then, of course, aggregation. There's some sensitivity issues, especially with the interviews, because there's so few. We have to ensure the confidentiality of our interviewees. And so how can I, for example, aggregate the data from the interviews? Can I aggregate it by state? Can I aggregate it by basin? And that might help. We might be able to demonstrate easier some of the maps that come out of those interviews. But again, there's aggregation problems, just like I showed you with the irrigated lands. So there's continuing, questions that we're dealing with as we build the geodatabase, and especially as new projects come in. And then, of course, compiling the data and then making sure that it's visually pleasing. That map that I showed you with ag water governance, that's all over the place. How do you demonstrate the complexity of the landscape in a visually pleasing way that makes sense, that's easy to understand? So these are questions we're dealing with. And I'd like to thank you all, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Okay, we will go ahead and questions from the crowd then.
Yeah, so that goes back to trying to understand specifically what are the issues that ag producers what are they facing with regards to changes in agricultural water. So these changes are, for example, transfers. So there's, because we're continuing to have population growth in the basin, scarcity of water, so we've got droughts, as you probably all know, going on continuously. This is a continuous problem, and so municipalities are constantly farmers' doorsteps looking for their water for different types of arrangements, leasing arrangements and exchanges. And so we're asking, I forgot to repeat your question. The question was, what are some of the research questions we're asking with regards to this project? So we're asking, what do you think about the changes? Are they good changes for you? Are they bad changes for you? I'm also very interested in at what scale are they thinking? Are they thinking just their local community? Are they thinking larger than that regionally? Are they thinking basin-wide, or even internationally? So we've been able really to decipher some of those issues. And then what are some of the solutions? So there are a lot of different kind of informal arrangements that are going on in the basin that just are not documented, and they have to get around some of the legal and some of the political barriers. And so these new arrangements are popping up all over the place, and there are some really great ideas of people on how they can, share water. So at the Colorado River Water Users Association that we went to, where we presented the database, and there were concerns about it, and others were very happy, to have access, really easy access to information like this. And so we talked about, sharing water. And so a farmer got up and he said, we don't share water. Who's sharing water? We sell water, we buy water, and we might exchange water or lease water, but we don't share water. And so a lot of the language that you're hearing about water sharing arrangements, maybe in the news, they're all over the place. It's all in perspective, like who wants the water and who has it. And so that's what we're asking them about. What kind of solutions can you put forth? Do you have any ideas about how to get around some of these legal and political barriers? And they do. And then, of course, questions, how can universities, continue to work with or partner with farmers and producers in the basin? So largely, land-grant universities have been quite involved with farmers in the field on a very technical capacity, looking at efficiency, looking at, conservation, farming, all kinds of things. And so we're curious, are there other ways? Has the land-grant university in your area been working with you? If not, why or why not? Did they used to work with you? Do you see another capacity for a land-grant university to work with you other than these technical at this technical level. Did that answer your question? Okay.
So in terms of the grants and things, I'm curious, so it sounds like you have different investigators working at different pieces of this. Can you talk a little bit about how you're going to bring that all together, and I'm also interested in sort of the common boundary analysis.
Yeah, so the boundary analysis piece, I'll start with that first, is not part of the larger project. It's closer to me in my dissertation. The boundary analysis, what I hope to do is identify patterns, and I actually have been able to identify patterns just in a preliminary analysis, which is pretty exciting. So governance patterns in the basin, and that kind of answers questions about how is water managed. What are the really important characteristics in governance that may be missing or not, and how do those boundaries define those characteristics? So that's, and I can answer a little bit more about that. So the question, I have to go back, and the question was, first, how is the collaboration piece working, that there's so many different people working on different things, and then the second question was about the boundary analysis, more kind of explanation about that. So to answer your first question, what I did forget to mention is that CSU is the lead on, in terms of the land-grant universities working together. So we really got the buy-in from the land-grant university, from the other land-grant universities, into further examining these questions, these research questions. And so when we've gotten together a couple times already, we kind of talked about our progress to date. We asked them for their input on the different activities, and then we used them a great deal in that exercise to identify geographic areas, issues, and potential interviewees. So, I mean, that was amazing. We really had their buy-in for that. So it really was like a full collaborative effort, even though CSU is taking the lead. And most everyone is under CSU, like the team the interview team, for example, Pete Taylor, Dr. Pete Taylor, and Mary Lou Smith. Mary Lou Smith is part of the Institute, and then Julie Kallenberger is doing the survey for her master's work. So she is also a research associate for the Water Institute. So everything's really under the Water Institute. And then we get together as a team periodically to check in.
Do we have any other questions?
I'm curious if you're able to get through some results from the Bureau of Reclamation things. We were able to, I think, effort quantify a lot of things on the basin scale that haven't been quantified on the basin scale. So we're in the course of two courses for something we're looking at, but I mean, if they were able to quantify water use and the economics and specializing in a lot of things that I wonder if we could look at. But I was wondering if you be able to do that or require.
Yeah, sure. The question was about the Colorado River Basin study that the Bureau of Reclamation just finalized, actually with the help of the 7 basin states. So that's why it was so successful, because it really was a partnership. And that data will be integral. It's amazing what they've captured and what they haven't captured in that study. But what they, I'm not quite sure how to tie in, at least to get what they've done up online and to bring some of that data into the geospatial database. I thought about it. So if you have any ideas about how to do that, or contacts even, we did work with the Bureau of Reclamation. Melinda did with for the irrigated ag lands work. There was a lot of buy-in from the Bureau of Reclamation on that, and a lot of the data I collected was actually from the Bureau of Reclamation. Believe it or not, it's very fragmented. The Bureau of Reclamation they have area offices in different parts of the basin, and not everybody has all of the same data. And so when I went looking for data, I did have to go to each area office and try to collect, and aggregate that data. It was not easy, and so it's amazing to me that they were able to pull the basin study off, which is really great. And they're now looking into what next steps. And maybe this is the next step. Get this data up online, make it accessible, right? I mean, it is accessible in reports, but it's not accessible to download for you to use or for me to use. So.
Well, thank you, Faith, and thank you, Amy, both. I appreciate you guys talking to us today about energy and water issues in the West. So, obviously a very complex topic, talking across boundaries, talking across different counties and everything. So we just want to thank you all for coming out today, and that's the end of our seminar. Thanks.